There's a point in your financial life that feels like it should solve everything. Not millions, not extreme wealth, just $500,000, $500,000. On paper, that number looks like security. It looks like progress. It looks like the moment things should finally feel stable. And yet, for many people who reach it, it doesn't feel the way they expected. Not broken, not struggling, but not free either. So what actually changes at $500,000? And more importantly, why doesn't it feel like enough? Before reaching this level, $500,000 carries a certain weight. It feels like a finish line, a number that represents discipline, consistency, years of effort. It's easy to imagine that once you get there, stress disappears, decisions become easier, progress accelerates. Because compared to zero or even $10,000, $500,000 is a completely different world. But that expectation creates a subtle problem, because it assumes that accumulation alone changes your position when in reality, position depends on something else entirely. At $500,000, something does shift. Not in lifestyle, not in appearance, but in structure. For the first time, your capital starts to matter. Not symbolically, but mathematically. At lower levels, growth is driven by contributions. Your effort is the primary engine. But as capital increases, the equation begins to tilt. Returns start to become visible. Not dramatic, but noticeable. A 7% return on $500,000 is $35,000 per year. That's no longer insignificant. That's a second income stream beginning to form. And this is where the real change happens. Effort is no longer the only driver. Capital begins to participate. $500,000, but here's where things get interesting. $500,000 is not the destination. It's the transition. You're no longer at the beginning, but you're not at independence either, which creates a strange position. You've made real progress, but you're still dependent on income. Your capital helps, but doesn't replace anything. And this is where expectations start to clash with reality, because the number feels large, but the function of that number is still limited. The reason $500,000 doesn't feel like enough is because it isn't designed to be enough. Not for full independence, not for complete freedom. At a standard withdrawal rate, $500,000 might generate around $20,000 per year. That's helpful, but it doesn't replace a full income, which means work is still required, decisions are still constrained, risk still feels real. So even though the number is large, your position hasn't fundamentally changed. This is where the real effect shows up, not in numbers, but in perception. Because once you reach $500,000, your reference point changes. Before, progress feels like survival, every gain feels meaningful. After, progress feels slower, expectations increase. And something subtle happens. The goalpost moves. $500,000 no longer feels like the destination. It starts to feel like the beginning of something else. There's another factor at play here: costs. Because while capital grows, so does the environment around it. Housing, lifestyle expectations, inflation, all of it scales. Which means, even as your net worth increases, your required level of security increases with it. This creates a compression effect, where gains feel smaller, targets feel further away. Not because progress isn't happening, but because the system adjusts alongside you. So if $500,000 isn't the finish line, what is it? It's leverage. It's the point where time starts to matter differently, decisions start to compound, small improvements begin to scale. At this level, allocation matters more than income, consistency matters more than intensity, patience becomes a real advantage. Because now, your capital can work. Not fully, but enough to start building momentum. The real shift at $500,000 isn't financial. It's strategic. You stop thinking in terms of, how do I earn more? And start thinking, how do I position what I already have? Because from here, the path forward is less about effort and more about structure. This is also where progress often slows, not because of lack of discipline, but because the strategy doesn't evolve. If someone continues treating $500,000 the same way they treated $50K, growth remains limited because the system has changed, but the approach hasn't, and that mismatch creates stagnation. Beyond this point, the focus shifts to protecting capital, allocating efficiently, allowing time to compound results. This is where the gap between effort and outcome begins to widen. Where smaller decisions produce larger effects, patience begins to outperform urgency, and eventually, capital starts to take over. $500,000 feels like it should change everything. And in some ways, it does, but not in the way most expect. It doesn't eliminate work. It doesn't create immediate freedom. What it does is change the structure underneath your financial life. It moves you from effort-driven growth to early-stage capital-driven growth. And that transition is where real momentum begins. Not instantly, not dramatically, but steadily. Because at this level, the goal is no longer to build from nothing. It's to build on something that finally has weight. If this helped you see the structure more clearly, subscribe to Capital Explained for more deep, analytical breakdowns. Thanks for watching.